Leona Hoff had always thought she would die a little later than this. Not today. Not now. But, of course, no one ever expects the end to come while they're still figuring out the best way to make their morning cup of tea. The street outside the cafe was a mess, as usual. The once proud city of Elmbrook had become a tangle of rusted cars, overturned trash cans, and people shouting at each other over things like how to keep the power grid running or why the water had suddenly gone out again. A street vendor hawked colorful plastic bottles of water in front of her window, though she was pretty sure the liquid inside was anything but potable. Leona glanced out the window, watching the chaos unfold with detached amusement. At 77, she had seen enough of the world to know that cities collapsed. It was just how things worked. No one could keep a good city up forever. Maybe that's why she'd stopped caring about it. Or maybe it was just the inevitable wear and tear of time creeping up on her, even though she wasn't sure she felt like she should have aged at all. She sipped her tea, barely noticing the strange metallic aftertaste. The tea was cold, a slightly bitter brew she had brewed hours ago and forgotten about while browsing through old notes from her youth. Time had a funny way of slipping away when you weren't paying attention. Then the jolt hit her. At first, it was subtle. She felt it in her chest, a soft throb that she mistook for a bad cup of tea or a muscle cramp. But then her skin prickled. She had lived long enough to know that something wasn't right. She looked at her reflection in the cracked cafe window, the reflection of a woman with graying hair, a few more wrinkles than she remembered, and a face that seemed, somehow, unfamiliar. What the hell? Leona muttered, blinking at her own reflection. Her hand lifted instinctively to touch her cheek, feeling the deepening lines along her jaw. She hadn't looked like this earlier, had she? No. She couldn't have. It felt like she had aged a year in the last minute, her skin sagging slightly, her eyes dimming as if some unseen clock was rushing her forward. Maybe I'm just tired, she whispered to herself, though she knew better. That was the trick of it. Aging didn't happen in a neat, linear way. It arrived in fits and starts, little surprise visits you didn't ask for. Like your knees aching one day for no reason, or suddenly finding yourself out of breath climbing a set of stairs. She laughed to herself, but there was no humor in it. Great. Just great. The city was dying, and now, so was she. She let her gaze drift back to the street. What was happening to the world around her? Or maybe the real question was, what was happening to her? She had been living on the edge of time for too long, always careful, always calculating the risks. But now, this sudden surge of time pushing her body toward some inevitable end? She had no idea what to do about it. Her heart raced, faster now. This is it, she realized. This is the moment. Leona set the teacup down with trembling fingers and leaned forward, bracing herself against the table. Her mind flickered back to her youth, when she had been at the forefront of time research. She had invented it, the theory that one could bend time, reverse it, change the way it unfolded. A dangerous theory, one she had hidden from the world after too many close calls. If anyone had known what she was working on, they might have used it, and that was too much power for anyone. Too much risk. But now, it felt like the only option left. She had promised herself once, long ago, that if the city ever reached the point of no return, if it was beyond repair, beyond hope, she would fix it. Somehow. Even if it meant disappearing entirely. Leona rubbed her face, trying to focus. She had to make a decision. Was this her time? Was she willing to erase herself from existence to save Elmbrook? She had always lived with the knowledge that time was a fickle thing, and now it was making its demands known. Hell with it, she muttered under her breath. She had no time to waste. No time to wonder if she was crazy. If she was going to do it, now was the moment. Leona reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small device, a sleek silver cylinder with a button that shimmered softly in the dim light. She had created this years ago, when she had first tested the bounds of her theory. It was simple, the power to rewind time. A second here, a minute there. But it had always come with consequences. The more she used it, the more it drained her. She had always assumed she had time to figure out how to make it work without sacrificing herself. But now, with the city teetering on the brink of collapse and her own body betraying her, there was no more time. She pressed the button. For a split second, nothing happened. The world around her seemed to stop. She closed her eyes, willing it to work, willing the air itself to bend to her will. Then, the familiar sensation hit her. The world jerked backward, like a skipping record. She felt herself sucked into a whirlpool of time. The cafe around her blurred and stretched, and suddenly, she was back, to the morning. The same street outside, the same clamor of people, the same drab, collapsing city, but something was different. A flicker of peace. A moment of stillness before the storm. Leona inhaled deeply, feeling a strange sense of relief. The tension had faded from her muscles. The city was breathing again, not yet fully consumed by the chaos it had become. The moment had reset. The disaster hadn't happened yet, and she hadn't disappeared. At least, not yet, but as the seconds ticked by, she realized something else, something important. The timeline wasn't exactly as it should have been. There were small differences: an abandoned car that wasn't there before, a shopkeeper who hadn't been standing on the corner earlier, and more importantly, a knot in her chest that hadn't existed until just now. It was as though the city was fighting back, resisting the changes she was trying to make. Leona exhaled sharply. This wasn't going to be easy. The timeline wasn't just a single thread. It was more like a web, a complex network of interwoven events, and each change rippled outward, causing new problems, new challenges. For a moment, she wanted to laugh. What did you expect? She thought. You think you can just fix things with a button press? She checked the time on her watch. It was almost noon. The city was already starting to stir, and it wasn't long before someone would notice that something strange had happened. But what did she have to lose now? Her body was falling apart, and the city was on the edge. Leona was willing to risk it all to give Elmbrook one last shot. Leona's journey was just beginning, and she knew the stakes. As she stepped outside, she could feel the weight of time pressing against her every step. She would need to use her power carefully, bending the fabric of reality without tearing herself apart in the process. The city needed saving, and she had the tool to do it, if only she could survive the consequences. The sound of distant sirens echoed, and for a moment, she felt as though she were walking on the edge of eternity. But there was no turning back now. Leona stepped into the street, and the bustling noise of Elmbrook swirled around her like a storm. She wasn't sure how far back she'd rewound things, but there was a subtle difference now. The air was slightly cleaner, the tension in the city felt a bit lighter, though just barely. It wouldn't take much to undo it, to let everything slip back into chaos. She had to keep moving. Her feet carried her down the cracked sidewalk, past a row of shops that looked strangely familiar, yet off. The window displays, once covered in graffiti, now seemed untouched, pristine in a way that didn't quite match the grime of the rest of the city. A man passed by her, and for a split second, their eyes met. She could tell he was trying to place her, but the look in his eyes quickly turned to one of confusion. Then, he turned away. Something about it felt wrong. That brief interaction, that flicker of recognition, like he'd known her once but now, somehow, didn't. The timeline was shifting around her, and each alteration she made was creating cracks she wasn't fully prepared to handle. She pressed on. The city had become a maze in her mind, a puzzle that she thought she could fix, but every turn, every little change, led her to new questions. She passed the park, the one where she used to jog in her younger years. The green was faded now, the playground deserted, the benches broken. In another life, Leona might have sat there, watching children run and play, imagining a future she could never have. But that was before the world had crumbled into this dystopia, before the chaos of Elmbrook had taken hold. She stopped for a moment, taking in the familiar sights. But now, it all felt distant, like a memory from another lifetime. "You're not real," she murmured to herself, her breath coming in shallow bursts. None of this is real. She shook her head. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she could still fix it. She could still do something to save the city, even if it cost her everything. The people of Elmbrook didn't even know what had happened to them. They couldn't, not yet. And if she played her cards right, they never would. As she walked deeper into the heart of the city, she thought of the device in her pocket, the tool that could undo it all. Time was a fickle thing, a thread that could snap with a single tug. She didn't know how long she had before the pressure from her manipulations would tear her apart, but she couldn't think about that now. She was running out of options. Out of time. It was strange, how the more she tried to fix things, the more the city felt like it was slipping further away from her grasp. She could sense the faint cracks in the timeline, the way it buckled and shifted under her control. The air seemed heavier, and her chest ached with the weight of it. She kept her head down, hoping no one would recognize her, hoping the world would simply let her be. But she had to stop at the corner. It was impossible not to. There, in front of her, was a building that used to be a grocery store. She remembered it well. The shelves were stacked with canned goods, the aisles organized neatly. Now, the windows were boarded up, the door shattered from some previous act of violence or desperation. People had looted it long ago. But there was something more. Something that she couldn't quite place. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, was standing near the broken door. She was looking down at something in her hands, her face pale, her eyes empty. Leona's stomach dropped. She knew that woman. Or, rather, she would know her. She'd never met her before, not in this version of time, but in the world she had come from, in the reality she had just unwound. She had known her well. The woman was a daughter of one of the last great families that had once helped hold the city together. She had been killed in one of the riots that had torn apart the city's last remaining infrastructure. But now, here she was, alive. The thought struck Leona like a blow to the chest. She had been able to save the city from a distant collapse, but this was personal. The woman's name was Emma, Leona remembered. She had met her once, a decade ago, at a conference on sustainable energy. She was bright, full of hope, a leader in her field. And yet, in another version of time, she had died in the riots. She was supposed to be dead. That was how things had unfolded, but now, standing in front of the destroyed grocery store, Emma was alive, and that made Leona's heart twist in her chest. There was no time to waste. Leona approached cautiously, trying to make her presence known without startling her. "Excuse me," she said softly. Emma looked up, her face softening at the sight of her. There was no recognition in her eyes, but that didn't matter. Leona felt a pang of guilt. Should she tell Emma who she was? Could she tell her? The young woman didn't ask who she was, but she seemed to sense something important in Leona's presence. "Do you need something?" Emma asked quietly. Her voice sounded more tired than Leona remembered. Leona paused, unsure how to respond. Should she explain everything? Tell Emma that she wasn't supposed to be here? That her life had been saved from a violent end? But the moment slipped away, and all she could manage was a simple nod. "I was just wondering if you're okay." Emma smiled faintly. "I'm as okay as anyone can be, I guess." She shifted uncomfortably, holding something wrapped in cloth in her hands. "I'm trying to find something important. For the city." She sighed. "Maybe it's already too late." Leona didn't know what to say to that, so she simply nodded again, watching the young woman carefully. And that's when she realized it. Emma wasn't just trying to fix the city, like everyone else. She was carrying something that had to do with the past, something Leona had seen before. It was a small device, like the one she carried in her own pocket. A chill ran down Leona's spine. She hadn't been the only one to bend time. And that meant she wasn't the only one paying the price. Emma's fingers tightened around the device, and she turned away. "Sorry." I have to go. Leona watched her disappear into the shadows, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. She could feel the tightness in her lungs, the suffocating sensation of time itself closing in. She had thought that rewinding things would fix everything. But this was no fix. This was a mess. She looked down at her own device. Her own ticket out of this nightmare. If she kept using it, if she kept bending time, would she lose herself too? Would the world she was saving forget her entirely? The question gnawed at her as she made her way down the street, the city growing darker and more unfamiliar with each passing moment. Time was slipping away, and the cost was rising. Leona wasn't sure how much more she could bear, or how much more she could undo, but there was no turning back now. The city was on the edge of oblivion. And she had already pushed it too far. The air grew heavier as Leona continued down the street, the sounds of the city reverberating around her like distant thunder, each step she took feeling more like a countdown. She passed familiar landmarks, their shapes twisted and stretched as though the very fabric of reality was being warped. The colors seemed too bright, the edges of the buildings sharper, the shadows deeper, as if everything around her were holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. And yet, she couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in her chest. It was as if her very presence was out of sync with the world, as though the time she had manipulated was pushing back at her, reminding her that no amount of control could stop the inevitable. The device in her pocket burned against her skin, the metal cool but pulsing with a strange energy. She had used it once, and the world had bent. But now, she wasn't sure how much of herself she had left. The changes she had made were not just about the city, about fixing broken things. No, the more she rewound time, the more she felt like she was fading from it, erasing herself bit by bit. It wasn't something she could control. She wasn't sure how much time had passed. Was it hours? Days? It felt like she had been walking for an eternity, and still, the weight of her decision hadn't quite settled. Elmbrook was still broken, but now it felt even more fragile, as though it were held together by the thinnest of threads. She could sense the cracks in the air, the slight hum of instability beneath the surface, and then she saw it, the bridge. The great bridge that had once spanned the river that divided the city. In the timeline she had come from, it had collapsed during one of the final riots, taking with it hundreds of people, families, and the last real connection between the city's two halves. The devastation had been a signal, a turning point. The moment the city had given up on itself. But now, here it was, stretching across the river in pristine condition, its support solid and unwavering. She stopped in her tracks. The bridge. It was perfect. Almost too perfect. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe she had done it. Maybe she had finally fixed it all. Maybe this was the turning point, the moment the city could heal. But the moment was fleeting, and doubt crept in like a dark cloud. She had seen this before, the glimmer of hope that faded with the reality. The bridge was not just a physical structure. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. If she had truly reset the timeline, why wasn't the rest of the city reflecting the peace she had hoped for? Why did the weight of her actions still sit so heavily on her chest? Leona stepped forward, her footfall echoing through the empty street. There were no cars, no people. Just silence, broken only by the distant murmur of the river. The bridge loomed ahead, a monument to something she couldn't quite grasp. It felt like a mistake, like she had missed something. She pulled the device from her pocket again, feeling its cold metal against her fingers. It was the tool that had gotten her this far, the tool that could, in theory, reset everything. But at what cost? Leona turned toward the bridge, watching the river flow beneath it. It was as though the water itself was moving forward, its current unstoppable, just like time. There was no going back. No way to undo the damage of the past without facing the future, the one that she couldn't be sure of anymore. And then, she heard it. A voice. Leona? She froze. The voice was soft, uncertain, but it was unmistakable. She turned slowly, and there, standing in the middle of the road, was Emma. The young woman she had seen earlier, the one who shouldn't be here, the one whose life Leona had known would end in the chaos of the riots. "Emma," Leona said, her voice catching in her throat. "What are you doing here?" I could ask you the same thing." Emma's voice was shaky, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. She was holding something in her hands again, wrapped tightly in cloth. Her face was pale, her movements stiff as though she were unsure of herself. Leona didn't know what to say. The weight of the device in her pocket seemed to grow heavier. Emma didn't know the truth. She couldn't. She couldn't bear to tell her. But there was no denying it anymore. Everything was connected. Every twist of time, every change she had made had consequences, and Emma was part of that. Leona stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching out. "You shouldn't be here. Not in this timeline." Emma blinked, her face a mixture of curiosity and fear. "What do you mean? What's happening to the city? What's happening to you?" The question hit Leona like a punch. She couldn't answer. Not really. The truth was too much, and she had already stretched the timeline beyond its breaking point. "I'm trying to fix things," Leona said, her voice cracking. "Trying to make it right." Emma didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her gaze darting nervously between Leona and the bridge behind her. I thought you were dead. That you died in the riots. I saw it happen." Leona's heart skipped a beat. She had known this was coming, the moment where everything would fall apart. Emma had seen the future, or at least a version of it. A version of it where she had failed, where the city had collapsed completely. She had already seen herself erased, a casualty of time, but Emma was still here, standing before her, alive. And that meant something. It had to mean something. Leona shook her head slowly, the weight of it all bearing down on her. "No. Not dead. Just lost." She looked away, her eyes scanning the empty streets. "I tried to fix it, but I don't know if I can anymore. I don't even know if I want to fix it." Emma took another step forward. "You're talking like you've been playing with time, like you've been changing things." Her voice dropped, her eyes searching Leona's face for answers. "Is that what's happening here? Did you change the past?" Leona closed her eyes, the crushing weight of her actions filling her chest. She had changed the past. And now, the past was changing her. "I thought I could save the city," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I don't know how anymore. It's not just the city that's breaking. It's me. It's all of us. The more I try to fix things, the more I lose. The more I forget." She turned away, facing the river. The sound of the water seemed to mock her, its current moving steadily forward while she remained stuck in the past. "Time's a terrible thing," she muttered, almost to herself. "It's a thief. And I let it take me." Emma's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Leona, stop. You're still here. You're not gone. We can fix it together." Leona's breath caught. Fix it together. The words felt hollow, like an empty promise. How could anyone fix what was already broken beyond recognition? How could Emma, a woman who had been dead in another version of time, help fix the mess Leona had made? But then, something clicked. Emma was part of the solution, part of the answer Leona had been looking for. She had been trying to save the city, too. Maybe they weren't so different after all. Leona turned back to face her, her eyes narrowing with determination. "Maybe we can," she said quietly. "Maybe we can." But as she reached for the device in her pocket, ready to make one final move, she felt a sharp pain in her chest. It was a wave of pressure, a sudden shift in time that sent her to her knees. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she might pass out. She could feel the timeline collapsing around her, and with it, a part of herself, her memories, her life, slipping away. The city was fighting back. And Leona knew, with a terrible clarity, that the price of saving it might be the price of losing everything. She looked up at Emma, her heart pounding. "It's too late," she gasped. "The timeline's collapsing. I can't stop it." Emma's face twisted in anguish. "No. You can stop it. You have to." But Leona knew better. She had used the device too many times. She had bent time too far. And now, time was pulling her under, erasing her from the fabric of existence. "I'm sorry," Leona whispered, and then, with one final, desperate press of the button, she let go.